Each presentation in this course is going to begin this way, with the title of the presentation and then a list of important terms, key terms, that you should keep careful track of when you encounter them in the course of the presentation. Because in most cases, these terms are going to appear in the quizzes and the examinations. Now, the list of important terms is not exhaustive. For example, you don't see war put up here as a term. That's because the concept of war is so expansive that there really wouldn't be any point in that. And then there are other things, pieces of information that may not be listed as key terms, but are emphasized enough in the course of the presentations or other materials that they're fair game as well. But in most cases, the key terms will be a pretty reliable guide to what you're going to be required to know for the quizzes and examinations. Now, by the end of this lesson, you should understand quite a few things. First, that the nature of war resists definition. And second, the distinction between conventional war and insurgency. And the dangers of an inadequate concept of war. War is the realm of chance and probability. Why definitions of war are inherently politicized. The definition of war is given by the famous Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz. Why warfare is a form of negotiation. And finally, Professor John F. Gilmartin's working definition of war. So that's kind of a tall order, but you'll get through it okay. All right. Now, between that slide and this one, I was going to put in the video clip of the messenger, but we'll pick up on the other side of the clip because the casualty notification team told the mother of Private First Class Burrell that explicitly that he had been killed by a roadside bomb in Iraq. And this is what the explosion of a roadside bomb looked like. This is the aftermath of a detonation of an improvised explosive device, normally called IED in Iraq. And you can see that the force of the explosion was enough to completely topple this vehicle. I think it's a Bradley armored fighting vehicle, but I wouldn't swear to it. Just this thing weighs many tons and just got flung over on its back. So this is what killed that young soldier in the video clip. And this Iraq war, codenamed Operation Iraqi Freedom, broke out in March 2003 when the U.S. military attacked the Iraqi armed forces in what was largely a conventional war. I'll explain what conventional war means in a minute. The administration of President George W. Bush expected the conflict to be brief and that the Iraqi people would, in the words of Vice President Dick Cheney, greet them as liberators. In fact, although the American military toppled the dictatorial regime of Saddam Hussein by April 30th, 2003, this conventional war, which is basically a clash between regular armed forces, which you sort of normally think of when you think of war. This conventional war was followed by an unexpected Iraqi insurgency that claimed the lives of the overwhelming majority of the 4,490 U.S. military personnel that were ultimately killed during the Iraq War. And because the U.S. military retained a presence in Iraq after the war's end, an additional 90 soldiers died in the years between 2011 and 2020. In the war in Afghanistan, codenamed Operation Enduring Freedom, which began earlier than the Iraq War, began in October 2001. This actually ended in a Taliban victory in August 2021. As of April 2021, the number of American service members killed in Afghanistan stood at 2,448. And as with the Iraq War, the war in Afghanistan speedily toppled the enemy regime known as the Taliban, as a prelude to eliminating Osama bin Laden, the mastermind behind the September 11th attacks carried out by Al Qaeda, as well as the Al Qaeda training bases operating under the shield of the Taliban. But as with the Iraq War, the initially successful operation was followed by an unexpected insurgency. This gets at several important points about war. First, there is a distinction to be drawn between conventional war, the clash of armies, like the Union and Confederate armies during the American Civil War, as depicted in this detail from the Gettysburg cyclorama, showing the climax of Pickett's charge on the third day of the battle. So distinction between conventional wars that looked like this and insurgencies like the one in Iraq and Afghanistan, or the one conducted by conservative white Southerners right here in the good old US of A in the 12 years after the American Civil War. And this insurgency that happened right here in this country in the American South ultimately returned the state governments of the defeated South to white supremacist rule that lasted for another 90 years. Briefly after the American Civil War, the federal government installed state governments that were politically controlled by the Republican Party that allowed for African American males to vote. There were quite a few African Americans elected to state office and to the U.S. Senate and Congress. This, of course, was anathema to white conservatives. And the reason why I say white conservatives is because there were some whites who were in favor of these Republican state governments. So it wasn't that Southern whites were just monolithically opposed to for the new dispensation that followed the American Civil War, but plenty of conservative white Southerners were. And this engraving shows the aftermath of the Colfax massacre in April 1873, which was the bloodiest single clash in this insurgency that occurred in the American South. And in this clash, 150 white Southerners, most of them Confederate veterans, killed between 80 and 150 African Americans, many of them executed after they had surrendered. Now, officially, the U.S. Department of Defense defines an insurgency as, quote, the organized use of subversion and violence by a group or movement that seeks to overthrow or force change of a governing authority, end quote. This is exactly how groups like the Ku Klux Klan, White Leagues, and the Red Shirts toppled the Republican-installed state governments in the former Confederacy. But it's important to note that the rampant politically motivated violence across the American South was largely treated by the federal government as criminal activity. So in the Colfax massacre, 97 members of the white mob were indicted, but only 9 men were actually charged and convicted, and they were convicted of violating 2 federal laws, the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871. Just 3 years later, their convictions were appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which overturned the convictions when it ruled that these enforcement acts applied only to actions by states, not by individuals. And indeed, ruling governments often fail to recognize insurgencies as such, either because they fail to understand that they're dealing with an insurgency, which I think was the case with the US government after the Civil War, or because they are reluctant to designate the political violence as an insurgency because it lends a quasi-legitimacy to the insurgents. The American occupying forces in both Iraq and Afghanistan initially termed the violence terrorism and minimized its extent. And terrorism implies attacks on a relatively small scale. You're talking about suicide bombers walking into a crowded market and killing, say, 15 or 20 people at a time, which is terrible. But that's That's not on a very large scale. And other terrorist attacks tend to be like that. And until September 11th, 2001, terrorism was always considered to be a relatively small scale activity. And when it succeeded, it was typically a death by 1,000 cuts. But that view of terrorism was overthrown when members of the terrorist group Al Qaeda launched a coordinated attack in which 4 US airliners were hijacked um, and essentially converted into cruise missiles. Uh, Two of them struck the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. This photograph shows the moment when the second World Trade Center tower was struck. A third hijacked airliner struck the Pentagon near Washington, D.C. A fourth airliner was hijacked, but its passengers were able to take control of the plane from the hijackers and crash the plane into a field outside of Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Its intended target was probably the US Capitol. About 3,000 persons died in the September 11th attack. Another 225,000 were injured. And the attack changed American society in lasting ways. It led directly to the war in Afghanistan and made politically possible the strike against the Saddam Hussein regime that became the war in Iraq. This gets at the second point. A limited concept of war can make it difficult to foresee certain kinds of attacks. A significant amount of intelligence pointed toward the September 11th attacks, but this was only realized after the fact. And the reason why there was this failure to see the attack coming was because US government intelligence agencies were not configured in such a way that they could coordinate information, intelligence about this impending attack. And that's because the US government defined war in such a way that the ultimate Al Qaeda attacks on September 11th fell between the cracks of military intelligence and intelligence gathered by civilian law enforcement agencies. And that, and again, that tracked back to the idea that the U.S. government just had a conception of war that didn't fit this particular happening. This photo shows desperate Afghans chasing a U.S. Air Force C-17 cargo plane as it departs from the airport in Kabul on August 16th, 2021. The fate of the U.S. operations in Afghanistan and Iraq underscores a third point. War is the realm of chance and probability. It is difficult to predict the course that a war will take, its duration, or its outcome. The US government expected a quick and complete victory in Iraq. Instead, it faced a 7-year insurgency, suffered far more casualties than expected, and achieved at best only a limited success. Similarly, when it invaded Afghanistan, the US government had no idea that this would result in a 20-year war. Moreover, after the early years of the struggle, the US government realized that it had no viable strategy for winning the war. It could have carried on the war indefinitely, but policymakers eventually realized that victory was just flat impossible and it was time to disengage. As a result, in February 2020, the Trump administration negotiated an agreement with the Taliban to enable the US to withdraw. In exchange for the release of 5,000 Taliban fighters and the promise that the United States would withdraw within the next 14 months, the Taliban agreed not to attack US soldiers. The Trump administration did not actually withdraw any troops, but it negotiated the agreement that required that their removal. In April 2021, the Biden administration that succeeded the Trump administration, of course, formally stated that it would honor the terms of that earlier agreement, only to be surprised by the speed with which the Afghan armed forces and government collapsed when the US military withdrawal began in early August. This led to a messy, chaotic evacuation of US citizens and Afghan nationals that was widely characterized as a more humiliating debacle than the US evacuation from its embassy in Saigon when the South Vietnamese government fell to the North Vietnamese in April 1975. So let me quickly review those 3 points that I made earlier and then add a fourth. First, there is a distinction to be drawn between conventional wars and insurgencies. Second, a limited concept of war can make it difficult to understand or foresee certain kinds of attacks. Third, war is the realm of chance and probability. Neither the course of a war nor its outcome can be predicted. And here's the fourth. Definitions of war are inherently politicized, and I'll explain what that all means in part 2 of this presentation.